The Economist.
July 8th to July 14th, 2017.
Word for word. The articles from this week's edition of The Economist, including...
From the Leaders section, World Economy, the German Problem.
From the Leaders section, North Korea, containing Mr. Kim.
From the Business section, Virtual Reality, Get Real.
And a special report on the economics of longevity.
The world this week. Politics.
North Korea tested an intercontinental ballistic missile, despite Donald Trump's insistence this year that it would never be allowed to develop such technology. The missile appeared to have a range long enough to strike Alaska, but not Hawaii or California. There are doubts that it has the necessary warhead.
Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party suffered its worst-ever defeat in Tokyo's local elections. It lost to a party set up by Yuriko Koike, a disaffected former LDP member, now the capital's governor.
Myanmar said it would not admit 3 experts whom the UN has appointed to investigate atrocities against the Rohingya minority.
A Chinese hospital that is treating Liu Xiaobo, a long-jailed dissident for advanced liver cancer, said it would invite foreign medical experts to help. Officials have refused demands from his family that he be allowed to go abroad for treatment.
In a speech in Hong Kong, marking the 20th anniversary of Chinese rule, President Xi Jinping said any attempt by people in the territory to challenge the power of the government in Beijing was absolutely impermissible. Shortly after he left, thousands joined a pro-democracy march.
The British government sent a task force to take over housing responsibilities from Kensington and Chelsea Council as the fallout from the Grenfell Tower fire continued. The government had already relieved the council of its responsibility for supporting the survivors after its inadequate response. The chief executive and leader have resigned, but Grenfell's residents are still angry, with some refusing alternative accommodation. They also blasted the appointment, without their consultation, of a retired judge to lead a public inquiry.
A deadline passed without agreement between Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party to break the deadlock over power sharing in Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin's leader, Michelle O'Neill, put the blame squarely at the feet of the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, for agreeing to a confidence and supply deal with the DUP, which gives Mrs May a slim majority in Parliament after a disastrous election for her Conservative Party.
Italy's new code of conduct limiting NGOs operating in the Mediterranean was endorsed by France and Germany after an emergency meeting in Paris. Facing pressure over a surge in refugees, Italy claims the presence of rescue boats creates a pull factor that encourages illegal migrants.
Emmanuel Macron's new government outlined its priorities for the next 5 years in France. The President called for amendments to the Constitution within the next year, notably the introduction of a form of proportional representation. Edouard Philippe, the Prime Minister, focused on the need to reduce spending and said planned tax cuts would be delayed, but he also announced a costly plan to improve infrastructure.
Donald Trump was welcomed in Warsaw by supporters of the ruling Law and Justice, or Peace Party. Poland's populist government, which rejects the EU's refugee policy and is suspicious of cosmopolitan liberals, sees Mr. Trump as a kindred spirit. His visit is expected to encourage nationalists throughout Eastern Europe.
Venezuela's political conflict intensified as a group of supporters of Nicolás Maduro, the president, stormed the National Assembly, which is controlled by the opposition, and assaulted lawmakers. Some of the legislators required medical treatment. Military police who were guarding the building did not intervene.
At least 17 members of a drug gang were killed in a clash with security forces in Mexico. The incident happened near the resort town of Mazatlan. In the state of Chihuahua, 14 men were killed in a shootout between rival drug cartels. Homicides are rising again in Mexico. May saw the highest murder rate since 1997.
In Brazil, police arrested Luis Carlos da Rocha, an alleged drug lord who had evaded capture for 30 years. Detectives used photo data to identify Mr. Rocha after he had his face altered by plastic surgery. He is accused of heading a network stretching to Bolivia, Colombia and Peru, producing 5 tons of cocaine a month.
Iraq's government was poised to take control of Mosul. Just a small part of the old city was still held by Islamic State 3 years after the caliphate seized it. In Syria, American-backed forces entered the centre of Raqqa, the caliphate's capital.
A deadline set by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for Qatar to meet a long list of harsh conditions in order to lift a partial blockade of the Gulf state expired. No further actions were taken for now.
The government of Burundi is purging its army of minority Tutsi officers little more than a decade after the end of a bloody civil war and genocide against Tutsis, according to a report by the International Federation for Human Rights and Burundi-based partners. The army is now dominated by Hutu officers and is becoming politicized, the report said.
The head of the European Union's team of observers for presidential elections in Kenya warned of the possibility of violence. Human Rights Watch, based in New York, separately said it had received reports of threats and intimidation in Nakuru County, which was hit hard by election-related violence in 2008. The vote is scheduled for August 8th.
Jihadists from Boko Haram, a Nigerian group, kidnapped 37 women and killed another 9 people in Niger.
New Jersey's Republican governor, Chris Christie, and the Democratic legislature reached an agreement on the state budget, ending a short shutdown of some government services. The shutdown had closed state-run beaches over the 4th of July weekend to New Jerseyans, except the governor and his family. They were photographed sunning themselves on an empty beach that was shut to the public, a perk of office. Mr. Christie is not running for re-election in November's governor's race.
The World This Week. Business.
Volvo became the first of the world's big car manufacturers to announce that it will stop making vehicles that run solely on an internal combustion engine. From 2019, the Swedish carmaker will produce models that are either pure electric, plug-in hybrid, or mild hybrid, which use an engine but can also travel on battery power for short distances. The car industry has been revving up for the changes wrought by new technologies, but Volvo is taking a gamble. Although it is growing, the market for green-friendly cars is still small.
After several years of booming sales, the car industry in the United States recorded a weak first half of the year. Overall sales to the end of June fell by 2.1% compared with the same 6 months last year. This is in part because General Motors, Ford and Fiat Chrysler have drastically cut back on selling vehicles to car hire firms and government fleets in order to maintain brand value.
Tesla's latest figures on production were at the lower end of its own estimates, a problem that has dogged the electric car firm in the past. In the first half of this year, it delivered a modest 47,100 vehicles, prompting its share price to drop by 10% in the 3 days following the announcement. Tesla may get a jump start with its new Model 3, priced for the mass market, which was expected to roll off the production line this week.
The Italian government's rescue plan for Banca Monte dei Paschi di Siena was formally approved by the European Commission. Under the plan, the bank will receive €5.4 billion, that's $6.1 billion of public money, giving the government a 70% stake, and its toxic loans will be bundled up and sold off. Italy's use of state money to prop up its distressed banks has been sharply criticised by some politicians in Europe for not living up to the spirit of the embryonic banking union, which seeks to avoid using taxpayers' money for bailouts.
4 former senior bankers at Barclays, including John Varley, a one-time chief executive, appeared in court to face charges relating to emergency funding the bank obtained from Qatari investors during the financial crisis in 2008. Barclays has also been charged in the case. A trial is expected to start on July 17th, at which the accused will formally enter their pleas.
EDF said that its projected costs for building the new Hinkley Point nuclear power station in Britain had risen by £1.5 billion, that's $2 billion, above its initial estimate. The French energy company thinks the controversial project will come in at £19.6 billion.
A $20 billion proposed merger between Huntsman, an American chemical company, and Clariant, a Swiss rival, ran into opposition from a pair of activist hedge funds that have teamed up to scupper the deal. The funds have taken a 7.2% stake in Clariant with the intention of stopping it from completing a merger which they say will destroy shareholder value.
The European Union and Japan reached a political agreement on the outlines of a free trade pact, overcoming obstacles on agriculture and cars. A final treaty has to be ironed out, but the agreement in principle represents a big advance for free trade after Donald Trump pulled America out of the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Vantiv, an American processor of credit and debit card payments, offered $10 billion to take over WorldPay, a British rival that specializes in mobile payments made in shops and on phones. WorldPay tentatively accepted the offer.
The ban on passengers carrying laptops on flights to the United States, originating in the Middle East, was lifted on 4 airlines. Etihad, Emirates, Qatar Airways and Turkish Airlines said they were now exempt from the ban which America imposed in March amid fears of a terrorist attack because they had improved their security checks.
Iran signed a deal with Total of France and CNPC, a Chinese state-controlled oil firm, to develop a huge offshore natural gas field. It is the first formal signing of a contract between a large energy company and Iran since the international accord in 2015 over its nuclear project lifted sanctions. That accord, and the deal with Total, was thought to be in jeopardy after the election of Donald Trump.
Following criticism from China's state media for failing to be socially accountable for its addictive content, Tencent said it would restrict the amount of time that Chinese children can play its Honor of Kings mobile game. The Chinese internet firm is limiting players aged 11 and under to 1 hour a day and 12 to 18-year-olds to 2 hours, though it is unclear how it can police the curbs. Honor of Kings is played by 55 million people a day in China, more than Pokemon Go at its height.
Leaders.
The Economist, July 8th to July 14th, 2017. In the Leaders section, World Economy, the German Problem, North Korea, Containing Mr. Kim, Longevity, Over 65 Shades of Grey, and more.
Leaders.
The German Problem. Why Germany's current account surplus is bad for the world economy.
The battle lines are drawn. When the world's big trading nations convene this week at a G20 summit in Hamburg, the stage is set for a clash between a protectionist America and a free-trading Germany. President Donald Trump has already pulled out of one trade pact, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and demanded the renegotiation of another, the North America Free Trade Agreement. He is weighing whether to impose tariffs on steel imports into America, a move that would almost certainly provoke retaliation. The threat of a trade war has hung over the Trump presidency since January. In contrast, Angela Merkel, Germany's Chancellor and the summit's host, will bang the drum for free trade. In a thinly veiled attack on Mr. Trump, she delivered a speech on June 29th condemning the forces of protectionism and isolationism. An imminent free trade deal between Japan and the European Union will add substance to her rhetoric. There is no question who has the better of this argument. Mr. Trump's doctrine that trade must be balanced to be fair is economically illiterate. His belief that tariffs will level the playing field is naive and dangerous. They would shrink prosperity for all. But in one respect at least, Mr. Trump has grasped an inconvenient truth. He has admonished Germany for its trade surplus, which stood at almost $300 billion last year, the world's largest. China's hoard was a mere $200 billion. His threatened solution, to put a stop to sales of German cars, may be self-defeating, but the fact is that Germany saves too much and spends too little. And the size and persistence of Germany's savings hoard makes it an awkward defender of free trade. At bottom, a trade surplus is an excess of national saving over domestic investment. In Germany's case, this is not the result of a mercantilist government policy, as some foreigners complain, nor, as German officials often insist, does it reflect the urgent need for an ageing society to save more. The rate of household saving has been stable, if high, for years. The increase in national saving has come from firms and the government. Underlying Germany's surplus is a decades-old accord between business and unions in favour of wage restraint to keep export industries competitive. Such moderation served Germany's export-led economy well through its post-war recovery and beyond. It is an instinct that helps explain Germany's transformation since the late 1990s from Europe's sick man to today's muscle-bound champion. There is much to envy in Germany's model. Harmony between firms and workers has been one of the main reasons for the economy's outperformance. Firms could invest, free from the worry that unions would hold them to ransom. The state played its part by sponsoring a system of vocational training that is rightly admired. In America, the prospects for men without college degrees have worsened along with a decline in manufacturing jobs, a cause of the economic nationalism espoused by Mr. Trump. Germany has not entirely escaped this, but it has held on to more of the sorts of blue-collar jobs that America grieves for. This is one reason why the populist AfD party remains on the fringes of German politics. But the adverse side effects of the model are increasingly evident. It has left the German economy and global trade perilously unbalanced. Pay restraint means less domestic spending and fewer imports. Consumer spending has dropped to just 54% of GDP, compared with 69% in America and 65% in Britain. Exporters do not invest their windfall profits at home, and Germany is not alone. Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark and the Netherlands have been piling up big surpluses too. For a large economy at full employment to run a current account surplus in excess of 8% of GDP puts unreasonable strain on the global trading system. To offset such surpluses and sustain enough aggregate demand to keep people in work, the rest of the world must borrow and spend with equal abandon. In some countries, notably Italy, Greece and Spain, persistent deficits eventually led to crises. Their subsequent shift towards surplus came at a heavy cost. The enduring savings glut in Northern Europe has made the adjustment needlessly painful. In the high-inflation 1970s and 1980s, Germany's penchant for high saving was a stabilising force. Now it is a drag on global growth and a target for protectionists such as Mr. Trump. Can the problem be fixed? Perhaps Germany's bumper trade surplus will be eroded as China's was by a surge in wages. Unemployment is below 4% and the working-age population will shrink despite strong immigration. After decades of decline, the cost of housing is rising, meaning that pay does not stretch as far as it used to. The institutions behind wage restraint are losing influence. The euro may surge, yet the German instinct for caution is deeply rooted. Pay rose by just 2.3% last year, more slowly than in the previous 2 years. Left to adjust, the surplus might take many years to fall to a sensible level. The government should help by spending more. Germany's structural budget balance has gone from a deficit of over 3% of GDP in 2010 to a small surplus. Officials call this prudence, but given high private sector savings, it is hard to defend. Germany has plenty of worthwhile projects to spend money on. Its school buildings and roads are crumbling because of the squeeze on public investment required to meet its own misguided fiscal rules. The economy lags behind in its readiness for digitalisation, ranking 25th in the world in average download speeds. Greater provision of after-school care by the state would let more mothers work full-time in an economy where women's participation is low. Some say such expansion is impossible because of full employment. Yet, in a market economy, there is a tried and trusted way to bid for scarce resources. Pay more. Above all, it is long past time for Germany to recognise that its excessive saving is a weakness. Mrs. Merkel is absolutely right to proclaim the message of free trade, but she and her compatriots need to understand that Germany's surpluses are themselves a threat to free trade's legitimacy.
Leaders.
North Korea. Containing Mr. Kim. America cannot stop North Korea from building long-range nuclear missiles, but it can deter it from using them.
The definition of an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, is one that can fly at least 5,500 kilometers or 3,420 miles. The weapon that North Korea tested with characteristic belligerence on the 4th of July had a range of perhaps 6,700 kilometers, so its claim to have built an ICBM is technically correct. That is not quite as alarming as it sounds. It allows Kim Jong-un, North Korea's dictator, to threaten Anchorage, Alaska, as well as America's bases on Guam and in Japan and South Korea. But Los Angeles and New York are still out of reach. Moreover, North Korea has not yet mastered the technology to protect a nuclear warhead as a missile re-enters the atmosphere. And for the North, to achieve much longer ranges, it will have to add a third stage to its two-stage missiles, a further technological leap. Nonetheless, Mr. Kim's drive to develop a nuclear-tipped missile capable of striking America is clearly advancing rapidly. At best, America may have a few years before North Korea can rain destruction on its cities, as it so often threatens. It was not supposed to be this way. When Mr. Kim boasted of being close to launching an ICBM on New Year's Day, Donald Trump retorted, "It won't happen." America tried to enlist China, North Korea's main trading partner, to persuade Mr. Kim to desist. For a few months, China made encouraging noises about curbing the flow of goods across its border with the North. But Mr. Trump's growing friendship with Xi Jinping, his Chinese counterpart, seems to have cooled. Mr. Trump recently admitted that pressing China into service has not worked out. What else can he try? Despite lots of martial talk from Mr. Trump, a preemptive strike against North Korea is a terrifying option. It would risk setting off a war on the Korean peninsula that could claim millions of lives. The less incendiary step of trying to shoot down Mr. Kim's missiles whenever he tests them would prevent the North from developing an ICBM, but America may not yet have perfected the anti-missile capabilities it needs. Mr. Trump might resort to direct negotiations with North Korea. He once said that he and Mr. Kim could settle all their differences over a burger at the White House. But it is hard to imagine that the North would really abandon its missile program, which it appears to view as its one ironclad defense against a hostile world. Meanwhile, the confidence-building step that the North demands of America, suspending all military exercises with South Korea, should be a non-starter. The exercises are legal, whereas the missile testing is not. Also, North Korea has a dire record of cheating on its commitments. Suspension would perturb America's allies, and China, which hates displays of American might on its borders, would have an incentive to keep Mr. Kim as a near-nuclear threat. Sanctions do make life difficult for the North Korean regime, but the only measures that might truly threaten it would be to cut its oil supply, and China has already declined to do that. America could punish more firms in China that abet trade with North Korea, secondary sanctions in the jargon, but the border trade is too fluid and diffuse to halt the determined Mr. Kim, who cares nothing for his people's hardship. For all of Mr. Trump's bluster, he has no good way of stopping North Korea from developing an effective nuclear weapon. Deterrence and containment remain the best and possibly only options to ensure that Mr. Kim is never tempted to use his horrifying arsenal. But if deterrence is to be effective, America's threats must be credible. So Mr. Trump must stop making promises he is not ready or able to honour. Promises like stopping North Korea from developing an ICBM.
Leaders.
Financial de-risking. Forget whiter than white. Swinging fines have made banks too risk-averse. Regulators need to rethink anti-money laundering rules.
In the go-go years before the financial crisis, banks grew careless about dirty money. BNP Paribas helped sanctions busters, HSBC channeled Mexican drug takings, and Deutsche Bank moved cash for Russian launderers. When regulators began to take oversight seriously, the money men paid a high price. BNP alone was fined $8.9 billion and temporarily barred from dollar clearing. Dozens of other banks have faced stiff penalties. The crackdown was merited, but some of its results have been perverse. Banks have pulled away from clients they fear might commit financial crimes and therefore regard as too dangerous to serve. Many have done so indiscriminately. Money transfer firms, especially those handling remittances to poor countries, and charities that work in conflict zones, have been hit hard by this de-risking. So have banks in Africa, Eastern Europe, Latin America and the Caribbean, which have been dropped by the Western correspondent banks they relied on to clear dollar and euro transactions. Some of the organisations and countries that have been abandoned deserve it. In Belize, correspondent banks have even pulled away from the central bank, a reasonable consequence of the country's sloppy money laundering controls. But others are better seen as collateral damage. The harm goes wider than specific institutions. People have frozen to death in Afghanistan and gone without medical supplies in Syria because legitimate aid groups had transfers delayed or their bank accounts closed. De-risking chokes off financial flows that parts of the global economy depend on. It undermines development goals such as boosting financial inclusion and strengthening fragile states. And it drives some transactions into informal channels, meaning that regulators become less able to spot suspicious deals. Popular though it has become to bash banks, they have been acting rationally. The blame for the damage that de-risking causes lies mainly with policymakers and regulators who overreacted to past money laundering scandals. They issued dire warnings about the dangers of serving entire classes of client, such as money transfer firms, and imposed swingeing penalties for infractions. No wonder banks dumped less profitable clients tainted by the merest hint of risk. Financial technology offers the prospect of filtering suspicious transactions from legitimate ones. People are excited about the blockchain, a distributed ledger technology that underpins Bitcoin, a digital currency. The blockchain could turn out to be a cheap, clean way to verify customers and transactions, but it will not be widely used for some time, if ever. The Financial Stability Board, an international group of policymakers, is aware of the problem. It is coordinating efforts to reverse the trend. But so far, it has done little except diagnose what is wrong. Persuading banks to re-risk will take more than toning down the warnings in regulatory guidelines. Banks deserve a new approach to financial regulation, one that accepts mistakes can be made in good faith. Multilateral institutions such as the IMF should do more to help the countries worst affected by de-risking to improve their financial oversight. Regulators should create white lists of reputable charities which banks can serve without fear. Most important, banks that can show they have strong anti-laundering controls and have done their due diligence should get credit for that if an occasional illicit payment slips through. A financial system that lets dirty money flow freely is a bad one. One that blocks clean money is even worse.
Leaders.
Longevity. Over 65 shades of grey. To get the most out of longer lives, a new age category is needed.
What do you call someone who is over 65 but not yet elderly? This stage of life between work and decrepitude lacks a name. Geriactives errs too much on the side of senescence. Sunsetters and nightcappers risk being patronising. Perhaps nippies, not yet past it, or owls, older, working less, still earning, ring truer. Branding an age category might sound like a frivolous exercise, but life stages are primarily social constructs, and history shows that their emergence can trigger deep changes in attitudes. Such change is needed if the questions that swirl around rising longevity are to get a fitting answer. Before 1800, no country in the world had an average life expectancy at birth beyond 40. Today, there is not a country that does not. Since 1900, more years have been added to human life than in the rest of history combined, initially by reducing child mortality and lately by stretching lifespans. Longevity is one of humanity's great accomplishments. Yet it is seen as one of society's great headaches. The problem lies in the increasing dependency of the old on the young. By 2100, the ratio of 65-plussers to working-age people will triple. As the world greys, growth, tax revenues and workforces will decline, while spending on pensions and healthcare will increase. So, at least, goes the orthodoxy. Doommongers tend to miss a bigger point, however. Those extra years of life are predominantly healthy ones. 5 of the additional 6 years that a British boy born in 2015 can expect to live, compared with one born in 1990, will be healthy, according to the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington. Too many governments and firms fail to recognise this fact, instead lumping all the extra years in the damning category of 65 and over. This binary way of thinking, seeing retirement as a cliff edge over which workers and consumers suddenly tumble, bears little relation to the real world. It also encourages unimaginative policy, whereby the retirement age is occasionally moved as lifespans lengthen. A more radical approach would start by acknowledging that, in the rich world at least, many of the old are still young. As this week's special report argues, they want to work, but more flexibly. They want to spend money too. In Western Europe, the over 60s will account for 59% of consumption growth in cities between now and 2030, says McKinsey, a consultancy. Declaring a new stage of life could help change perceptions. It has done so before. Today's conception of childhood emerged in the 19th century, paving the way for child protection laws and a golden age of children's literature. Spotty, awkward 15-year-olds predated the 1940s, but only then did mystified adults coin the label teenagers, fueling all sorts of products and services, from bobby socks to the music industry. In 1944, Life wrote that American businessmen, many of whom have teenage daughters, have only recently begun to realize that teenagers make up a big and special market. By the mid-1960s, both Time and Newsweek had splashed "The Teenagers" on their covers. Marking out youthful old age as a distinct phase of life might have a similar effect, prodding employers and policymakers to think differently about how to keep the young old active. As life becomes longer, the word retirement, which literally means withdrawal to a place of seclusion, has become misleading. At 65 you are not clapped out, but pre-tired. So, as they embark on the next stage, here's to all those pre-tirees.
Leaders.
The war against Islamic State. After the Caliphate. No one knows what will happen after the jihadists lose Mosul and Raqqa. That is alarming.
It has been a long war with many horrors, but 3 years after Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi ascended the pulpit of the Nuri Mosque in Mosul to call on all Muslims to flock to his caliphate, Islamic State, or IS, is suffering 2 crushing blows. In Iraq, the jihadists have all but lost Mosul. They blew up the Nuri Mosque in their last stand in a pocket of alleyways. Mr. Baghdadi, if he is alive, may have fled to Syria, but IS is faring badly there too. American-backed fighters have pushed into the old city of Raqqa. IS's Syrian stronghold will fall soon. With the loss of its biggest cities, the mystique of the jihadist state is being shattered. IS is turning into a nasty militia and may yet become a nebulous terrorist group like Al-Qaeda. The world should rejoice at its decline. IS committed untold barbarity, from mass beheadings to sexual enslavement, and inspired jihadists to kill the innocent in Europe and elsewhere. America has led the campaign ably, giving training and air support, while letting local allies do the ground fighting. But what will come after the caliphate? No one knows, least of all Donald Trump. He has yet to fill nearly 200 foreign and national security jobs, and policy-making in his administration is dysfunctional. That is alarming. Adrift, America faces 2 perils. One is a vacuum that allows jihadists to regroup, as they did repeatedly in Iraq. The other is being sucked into a regional war that would make everything worse. The bloodbath in the Middle East consists of many conflicts. Revolts against oppressive rulers who failed to earn legitimacy or foster prosperity, struggles over competing forms of Islam, regional contests between Saudi Arabia, Iran and Turkey, and rivalry between America and Russia. At its heart is Sunni Arabs' sense of dispossession, of which IS is the most grotesque manifestation. So America needs a strategy with many dimensions, blending military, political and economic means, and taking account of the complex geopolitics that feeds chaos. There is no sign that Mr. Trump's administration is engaged in such thinking. On his first trip abroad to Saudi Arabia, he was feted by Arab and Muslim leaders and regaled with juicy defence contracts. In return, he seemed to embrace the Saudi worldview, and thus precipitated a crisis among America's Gulf allies. Emboldened, the Saudis and Emiratis, along with the Egyptians and Bahrainis, cut off land, sea and air links with Qatar. They accused the upstart gas-rich kingdom, which hosts America's biggest airbase in the region, of supporting terrorism, a charge often levelled at the Saudis. Mr. Trump denounced Qatar on Twitter, but Rex Tillerson, America's Secretary of State, instead chastised the boycotters. James Mattis, the Defence Secretary, signed a deal to sell F-15 jets to Qatar and sent 2 warships to call at Doha. Amid such incoherence, a strategy may fail, even if one existed. Mr. Trump seems to have 3 vague aims: destroy IS, roll back Iran's growing power, and reduce America's involvement in the Middle East. These are inconsistent, because sustained diplomatic and military engagement will be needed both to prevent a new IS rising from the ashes of the old, and also to contain Iran, which is using its proxies and its own forces dotted around the region to extend its influence. Start with IS. To lock in its victories against the jihadists, America must back pluralist and decentralized politics, don't call it democracy, that gives voice to the region's disparate groups, especially Sunni Arabs. In Iraq, America must urge the government to woo Sunnis and to include them in running the country, and it should use its air power, special forces and diplomats as a counterweight to Iran. Syria will be even harder. The end of the civil war is a long way off. Mr. Tillerson has put out feelers to Russia about cooperating to stabilise the country, but what he wants is unclear. For now, America can help local allies push down the Euphrates Valley, not just to defeat the remnants of IS, but also to ensure that border crossings are in friendly hands. That would also secure an American voice in future peace talks. This will mean redoubling the effort to train more moderate Sunni Arabs. The alliance led by Kurds is unlikely to want to go beyond Raqqa. The priority will thus be to foster a southern Arab force to fight and draw away support from IS. Inevitably, that will bring America into further contact with Iran. America's forces and their allies are already rubbing against Syrians and others pushing eastward, seeking to link up with Iranian-backed Shia militias in Iraq and create a land corridor from Iran to Lebanon. America shot down a Syrian jet and bombed Iranian-backed fighters that threatened American and Allied forces at Al-Tanf, near the southern border with Jordan and Iraq. As if that were not complex enough, Mr. Trump says that Iran has been put on notice, although he has for now kept to Barack Obama's deal that froze Iran's nuclear program. As the administration debates a new Iran policy, there is much talk of fresh sanctions, with some arguing for coerced democratization, that is, toppling the mullahs. America could thus end up at war with Iran by military accident, or by being goaded into it by Gulf allies, or because it succumbs again to the delusion that overthrowing foes is easy and painless. A conflict with Iran is unlikely to unseat the clerics, but it will undoubtedly spread instability and Shia radicalism. Iran is too big to be excluded from the region's affairs, but it can be contained by a mixture of pressure and dialogue. America should therefore work to end the row among its Gulf allies, which benefits Iran, just as it should act to halt the war in Yemen, which creates space for Al-Qaeda. Whatever America does will be messy, and its aims ought to be limited. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq after the 9/11 attacks show that it is good at defeating foes, but poor at building lasting institutions. Grand plans to remake countries are usually doomed. Yet the collapse of Syria and the rise of IS since 2011 show that neglect poses grave dangers too. America has no choice but to contain the worst of the tumult. Mr. Trump needs to hire good experts and draw up a plan, fast.
Letters.
On Hungary, property transparency, Mexico, opioids, Shakespeare.
Hungary's Prime Minister.
From Zoltán Kovács, government spokesman, Cabinet Office of the Prime Minister, Budapest. According to The Economist, Viktor Orbán, Hungary's Prime Minister, is eroding democracy. Article, Stop Spoiling Viktor Orbán, June 24th. You call on the European Union to take action. Your editorial begins with a standard polemic. Mr. Orbán was once a young, courageous rebel who stood up to communism, called for free elections, and demanded the withdrawal of Soviet troops. Pity how things change, you say. Indeed, much has changed in the world since that heroic speech in 1989. But our Prime Minister's cause remains the same, a strong and independent Hungary at home in a strong Europe. Contrary to your narrative, democracy is doing just fine, thank you. Elections remain free and, yes, fair. The laundry list of old issues was all put to rest long ago in our conversations with the European Commission. That's not the problem. The problem is that since taking office again in 2010, Prime Minister Orbán has dared to defend Hungary's national interest, ruffling some feathers. When the European Troika advised us to take severe austerity measures, Hungary sent them packing and instead pursued its own reform path. It was dismissed as unorthodox then, but today Hungary's GDP growth is one of the best in Europe. The deficit is under control, debt is on the decline, and unemployment is at record lows. Our relationship with Russia is based on the pragmatic position that our economy benefits from normal relations with Europe's eastern neighbour. Meanwhile, we stand with the European Council on sanctions. Prime Minister Orbán has dared to oppose the European Union on migration, challenging the compulsory resettlement quota. Hungary has insisted on tough border security, opposed policies that would encourage migrants to come to Europe, and proposed asylum processing centres in hotspots outside Europe. The fence we built on the southern border is defending Europe's Schengen area, reducing illegal entries along that border to practically zero. Europe should be thankful. And many of our European allies, in fact, are, which is why we won't be seeing the EU taking the kind of action suggested in your editorial. Hungary holds dear its national independence. In 1989, the issue was independence from the Soviet Union. Today, the threat to our national sovereignty takes on a much different, more benign shape. It's about defending a strong EU based on strong nation-states, limiting the overreach of an unelected central bureaucracy in Brussels. In that regard, it's not Prime Minister Orbán who has changed. Perhaps it's Europe.
Who owns the property?
From James Cohen, Interim Executive Director, Transparency International Canada, Toronto. One factor that you did not mention in your report on Canada's attempt to curb its booming house prices is the influence of illicit money on the housing market. Article Maple Grief, June 17th. Canada has become such an attractive destination for money launderers and tax dodgers that they have a unique term for their practices, snow washing. Transparency International Canada has found that in Vancouver, Canada's most overheated market, nearly half of the luxury properties we surveyed were owned through opaque structures such as shell companies, trusts or nominees. Making property ownership more transparent would discourage the flow of laundered money from abroad into Canadian property and would deter the use of local nominees and shell companies to circumvent the foreign ownership tax and other efforts to curb speculation. Though Canada has made lofty pledges at the G20 and other forums to improve ownership transparency, so far it has done little to keep step with the likes of Britain and the EU, which are making commendable progress towards publicly accessible registers of beneficial owners.
Not so PRI dominant.
From Kevin Middlebrook, Professor of Latin American Politics, Institute of the Americas, University College London. Your assessment of the future electoral prospects of Mexico's Institutional Revolutionary Party holds that the once hegemonic PRI retains a voto duro, a hard core of supporters, many from trade unions. Article Keystone State, June 3rd. For many decades, government-allied unions were indeed a pillar of the PRI-dominated political order. However, that base of support is now greatly reduced in size and much less reliable in electoral terms. Indeed, in 2006, a higher percentage of union household members reported supporting the National Action Party's presidential candidate, Felipe Calderón, than the PRI's Roberto Madrazo. Many union leaders will no doubt back the PRI's presidential candidate in 2018, but the party can no longer take for granted the loyalty of union members in the voting booth.
Virtual reality and opioids.
From Dr. David Rue, Head of Healthcare and Fitness, Samsung Electronics America, Los Angeles. Ohio High, article June 10th, underscored the need for medical science to explore new treatments for chronic pain in order to reduce America's dependence on addictive opioids. To that end, we're already seeing a promising, if unexpected, form of treatment, virtual reality, or VR. Recent studies have shown that VR is helping patients across a spectrum of conditions, ranging from post-traumatic stress disorder to dementia to spinal cord injury. A large randomised controlled trial currently underway at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, in partnership with Applied VR and Samsung, is evaluating the effects of VR as a pain management tool for hospitalised patients. Preliminary data indicate that VR reduces pain by 25% and potentially decreases narcotic usage. We cannot solve the opioid problem overnight, but if the final results of this trial confirm these findings, VR could provide a safe, non-invasive alternative.
I crave no pelf.
From John Doherty, Stratford-upon-Avon, Warwickshire. Lexington's search for Trump in Shakespeare, article June 17th, omits the pained query in Timon of Athens. What means that Trump?
From Hugh Clift, Lesmurdie, Australia. Lexington might, if he had referred to the President's performances on the world stage, have reasonably turned to Measure for Measure. Man, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority.
From Anthony Peterson, Peterborough, Canada. Mr. Trump's tweets are straight out of Macbeth, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing.